I grew up in a family that was both Methodist and Mennonite. And so we would tend to flip-flop back and forth between the Methodist church one Sunday and the Mennonite church another Sunday. I now know that my Methodist church experience was what I would think of as a high liturgy, pretty formal Methodist experience. As a child, my parents took us to worship every Sunday, and then we got to go to Sunday school, which I loved, especially when they had the flannel board out. And I remember worship having a few things that I liked and a lot of things that bored me. Our pastor, Dr. McClure, he was always Dr. McClure, wore his formal black doctoral robes when he preached. And in my mind, he was always the kind of person that was up there somehow. He was somebody that I knew I was supposed to respect, which meant when I was a child I was supposed to be afraid of a little bit, but he was always sort of up there. Worship for me was fun because my parents are great singers, and I loved to listen to them sing the hymns, and my mom would harmonize, and that was glorious. But my favorite thing was that at College Hill United Methodist Church, the last page of the Sunday bulletin was always blank, so I had lots of room to draw, so that was the funnest time. And one Sunday, I remember this experience. I was probably 9 years old, and we were trying to get out of the building. I have 3 siblings, 2 brothers, and so whenever we were going anywhere, it was kind of a wrestling match between Steve and Clint and I. And my parents were trying to shepherd us or herd us out the door. And we were shocked because suddenly this apparition appeared in front of us. Suddenly there was Dr. McClure in his black robes. And I remember he spoke to us kids. I have no idea what he said because we were struck mute. There was kind of an awe of this guy, I think slack-jawed looking up at him. And my mother, bless her heart, was a little frustrated. You know, one minute she couldn't get us to be quiet, and now suddenly with the senior pastor there, we won't say a word. So she's trying to help us, so she says to us, "You all know who this is, don't you?" And I wasn't about to say anything, but one of my younger intrepid brothers said, "Yes, it's God." Which I assumed was the right answer. Well, I have the privilege of studying people like Dr. McClure. I'm sure he would have been a bit embarrassed to hear that. But even in studying clergy, there is something about those of you in your roles that is divine, that is holy, and that is sacred. And so our Flourishing in Ministry study is to understand well-being of clergy. This is our website, and I'll invite you to go there to see some of our reports. We're really trying to understand 3 major questions. The first question is, what are the signature characteristics of pastoral well-being? What does it look like when a clergy person has high levels of well-being? What does it look like when a clergy person has low levels of well-being? We're studying pastors from a variety of denominations. We have 13 currently represented in our study. We'll be adding some more. In fact, the Foursquare Church will be joining us soon this year. We're studying clergy of many different ages, many different tenures in ministry, certainly male and female, different gender identities, different sexual identities, all kinds of differences among clergy to understand if the characteristics of well-being differ across groups. And we're also studying the well-being of clergy families, focusing right now on spouses, to understand how a life in ministry, particularly when one person is so intimately involved, impacts the well-being of the rest of the family. Our understanding of well-being really draws from the research on positive psychology. I don't like that term very much. But in positive psychology, we think of well-being of having at least 2 dimensions. One, I love the way Chris said this, abundance of positive moods and emotions, abundance of positive affect. Happiness, according to this model, is your chronic daily affect. Do you have more good days than bad days? And your daily subjective experiences of your life. Sometimes we use the word satisfied, but it's more than that. Is there, in that current life, are there positive experiences? Do you feel like you're contributing in important ways? So we're studying what shapes different levels of these chronic moods and emotions. And thriving, which has more to do with a sense of meaning and purpose in life, the extent to which individuals feel like they can live in the important domains of their life with meaning and purpose, the extent to which they feel that they can make important and significant contributions, and their experience of whether or not there is this upward trajectory in their life. We call it growth towards excellence. So we're studying pastoral thriving both, and maybe most importantly, in their work domain, but in their overall life. We're also interested then in what are the conditions that nourish and sustain well-being, both forms of well-being. What are the factors, the conditions that cause higher levels of well-being? What are those factors and conditions that diminish it? And by factors and conditions, we mean a variety of things, certainly church context, the sort of usual suspects of small, medium, large church, rural, suburban, urban church. We're looking at the kinds of relationships that pastors experience, how those affect well-being. We're looking at ministry context experiences. We're looking at personal characteristics. This is a domain that we would learn a lot from you, personal characteristics and how those shape well-being. And this is a longitudinal study. So we're going to be studying well-being over a lifespan or a lifetime in ministry. What are the factors that cause ebbs and flows in well-being? Is it true, as some people have told us, that well-being for somebody young in ministry is different from somebody older in ministry? This gentleman's very famous at Notre Dame, his father, Ted Hesburgh. He's been in ministry for over 7 decades. First as a parish priest, then as an army chaplain, a professor at Notre Dame, our most famous and longest-serving president. He was a part of the civil rights movement. Since his retirement, he's become an important part of many different civic and social movements. In other words, the context of his ministry has changed many different times. We'd like to understand how his well-being changes and what causes dips and peaks and valleys in well-being over a lifespan. Today I'm going to share with you the results of a brand new study. We're just about to finish writing it up, studying how pastoral identities form. And the reason we decided to focus on this is that in our initial large-scale surveys, it became evident in our data that this period, what we call initial enactment, the first time an individual fills the pastoral role. In United Methodist Church, this would be the first appointment. In other systems, it would be the first call. That somehow, after that moment, clergy appear to be on a trajectory of well-being. Some clergy are on a trajectory of lifelong well-being, and it will be hard to knock them off of that trajectory. And others appear to be on a trajectory of lifelong struggle. In other words, there was something about this period before and during initial enactment that seemed to cause and shape well-being for many years in the future. Now, we'll be able to confirm that when we study clergy over time, but we had enough data to suggest that it was important. So we set out to study that period before and during this time we call initial enactment. And so we studied, we did deep narrative interviews with over 200 clergy. So these are 2-hour or longer interviews to gain their stories, their narratives of that time period from before they even thought about being a pastor, up through the time they answered the call to ministry, and then through this period of their first formal enactment, the first initial enactment of the pastoral role. Now, because all of these clergy had participated in our survey studies, we also had very good measures of their current levels of well-being. So we could sort the pastors that we interviewed by those who displayed high levels of well-being, wherever they were in their current tenure in ministry, and those that had low levels of well-being and could look for patterns, differences in the patterns between those clergy and the stories they told us of these really formative periods of their life. And what we found both surprised us and helped us realize that this early period is of critical importance. And we did find some significant patterns in the experiences of those clergy who have high levels of well-being. Because our survey participants, because our interview participants represented so many different times in ministry, we have a great deal of confidence that this represents something about what causes that positive trajectory, what makes it more likely that a clergy is going to be on that path toward lifelong well-being. So I'm going to walk you through what we found. What we found are that there are really 3 important phases to this identity formation process. That's really what happens, we found, in this initial enactment. That a pastoral identity emerges during that period of time. If it's a positive and strong pastoral identity, then this seems to be one of the most important determinants for that lifelong well-being. But if a weak or fragmented or unstable identity emerges from that initial enactment, that clergy person may never have an opportunity to bolster their identity, at least under the current system, and therefore be in this many decades of struggle for well-being. So we found two cycles that are separated by this really important psychological commitment period. And I want to walk you through what we found. And I hope then suggest to you some of the ways that this could help you in the work that you're doing. And again, the key is that this is a period of time in which, from our perspective, a pastoral identity forms, for better or for worse. The first period of time happens before probably most of you see these individuals. This starts for some individuals early in their childhood. For most others, then it happens during their early adolescence, where they're starting to learn about themselves, gain insights into what we call their true self. And as they gather these insights through this sort of iterative and organic process, they began to sense or imagine where a person such as them could live their life and could find work that's a calling. There are really two important parts to this: gaining true self-knowledge, and then mapping, as I'll talk about, and imagining oneself in particular professional roles. The true self-knowledge piece is what we will end up calling personal authenticity. It's getting to know your true self. One of the things we found in the stories of individuals who have high well-being is that early on, they knew that if they were going to find work that they were called to do, they had to know their truest self. They had to learn who they are, who they were created to be, and that their assumption was that that would form the foundations for the kinds of work that they could do, that they would experience as a calling. So this was experienced in a variety of ways through discovery and exploration as people gained these insights into their core self elements. And three kinds of core self elements emerged as really important to individuals' ability to say, I know something about my true self. I know something about who I really am. The first are capabilities. So capabilities, I think, are what are oftentimes called gifts. Capabilities are talents, aptitudes, knowledge, skills, and abilities. They are innate capabilities that can be developed into skillful ways. So, for example, some of our clergy told us the stories of, I was always good at public speaking. It frightened me, but I always felt like I could speak well in public. Or clergy that said, I was always interested in studying, particularly things like history. And then when I discovered Scripture, I loved the study of Scripture. So part of this true self-knowledge was gaining a sense of one's innate talents, the kinds of things that one was born to do well and then could develop through education and training and experience to use proficiently and skillfully. A second set of important self-dimensions were personal characteristics. For us, this would include personality. I often think of the big five personality. Enduring dispositions, enduring attitudes. So, for example, for me, I'm an extrovert. I score high on openness to experience. Another part of my personal characteristics would be I'm a baseball fan. And if you're a true baseball fan, you know that's not a trivial thing. It's somehow deeply embodied in who I am. You know, if you don't love baseball, I'm sorry. We're just different kinds of people. That's how important it seems to be to me. So discovering their preferences, their deep interests, their curiosities, as well as their personality, and understanding that side of themselves was an important part of gaining true self-knowledge. But the essence of true self-knowledge seemed to be what we call core commitments. Understanding their core values and beliefs. Understanding their deep moral commitments. Oftentimes, our interviewees express this as my passion. The sorts of things that I care deeply about. But it wasn't enough just to identify those. These were individuals that explored in a very deep way, why do I hold that value or belief? What does that value or belief really mean to me? And as a consequence, what role will that value or belief have in directing my life? As they gained this insight into their true self-knowledge, their core commitments became for them the core of their self-understanding. When it came time to say, am I an authentic person? What constitutes personal authenticity? It is knowing my capabilities and characteristics, but more importantly, it's knowing those passions that underlie my entire worldview. So a part of this discernment process for these individuals that were flourishing in ministry was to gain this deep insight into their true self. Again, this was done organically over time through experiences and personal reflection. And after they had this sense of their true self, and accumulating true self knowledge continued for them for many years, but when they had a sense of some of the core of their true self, then they began to look for ways of saying, well, what kind of work could a person such as I do well? And this is the part of the discernment cycle that we call mapping and imagining. And exemplars played a really important, maybe critical role in this process. Oftentimes they use the word role model. We use the word exemplar because for these individuals, an exemplar is an individual who is the epitome or the ideal of a person living out a calling in some sort of professional role. Exemplars are individuals who are highly proficient at their work, but more importantly, who seem to love their work, who seem authentic in their role. Individuals who seem to be living a calling. And so these individuals, as they gain this true self-knowledge, would look around to spot exemplars in several, sometimes a variety of different professions, and start to ask the question, can I do that kind of work? Can a person such as me do that kind of work? Can somebody with my capabilities and characteristics be proficient? And the way they gained that insight was to find some exemplar who they felt like shared their capabilities and characteristics. They could map their own capabilities and characteristics on another and see in that person, yes, somebody with my talents, somebody with my gifts and graces could do that work and do it proficiently. In other words, imagining oneself as being able to be proficient was really important part of sensing a call to ministry. But more importantly for them was to answer the question, could I be that kind of a person? At some deep level, they understood that to live a calling is to be a certain kind of person. In words that they didn't even have, to take on an identity as a certain kind of person in a certain kind of role. And so what exemplars was most important about exemplars was seeing somebody living out core commitments that that individual shared. These exemplars ended up being admired individuals because they represented people who were living out the same life passions in a way that was proficient, and these individuals could begin to imagine that, yes, somebody like me could be that kind of a professional and could live out a calling in that sort of a profession. And so for our clergy, of course, the people that were most important exemplars for them were somebody in ministry who was proficient at their work, who seemed to be called to their ministry, and in whom they could see some sort of a mirror reflection of themselves. Somebody they could admire and in some ways idolize, aspire to be like. And it was through this process of gaining self-knowledge, mapping and imagining, that this deep intuition, we call it intuitive awareness, began to bubble up. A deep understanding as they connected the dots of their own life, as they connected the dots of what they've learned about themselves, with what they saw in some compelling exemplars. This deep insight, deep intuitive awareness began to bubble up. And for most of our pastors, that was what they described as God's call to them. So for this mapping and imagining, one of the things that they needed to do it well was what Charles Taylor would call webs of interlocution. That's a good philosopher's term. They needed rich conversation partners, people that they could share their growing knowledge about themselves. They could test, is this true about me? Is this authentic to me? Do I really do this well? People that they could converse with about their mapping. Well, I think I might be good at this. They could talk about their insights, their growing feelings. Somebody that they could imagine with. They could actually dream about being somebody in a particular role. You know, when I was a child, I never had an opportunity to imagine myself as a professional baseball player. It turns out I don't have the capabilities or characteristics to play baseball, but it would have been lovely to be able to have a chance for somebody to help me imagine why I wanted to be a baseball player and what it was about playing baseball that I felt like might have been fulfilling and important to me. Well, these individuals that are flourishing in ministry had this web of interlocutors. Family members, friends, wise elders, certainly pastors, that would just spend time with them reflecting back and speaking with them about this growing self-knowledge and about their sense of where they might be called. And so what emerged at the end of this discernment was a really clear and powerful image of themselves as being called to a particular profession. In addition to pastors, we've studied physicians and humanitarian workers and educators. And we found the exact same pattern across all of these different professions. What emerged at the end of discernment is this deep sense that I'm called, and an image of yourself, a very personalized image of yourself as this kind of a profession, as a pastor. Now, this is a very risky and precarious position to be in, because you feel a deep sense that I am called to do this, and yet you have never done it. You've never been a pastor. Well, maybe you've led a youth group, maybe you got to preach on Youth Sunday, but this is a precarious time for these individuals to feel this powerful sense that you should do something with your life. But realize that the only way you'll ever learn about it is to commit yourself to becoming such a person. And so we find that this moment of acknowledgement is a very powerful part of this process of answering a call. Now, during this time of discernment, personal agency seemed to be a key part of determining whether somebody emerged from discernment with this clear image, or whether they emerged with some sort of fractured or hopeful or sort of precarious image of themselves. By personal agency, we mean self-reflectiveness, self-awareness, self-control. In social psychology, we would call this self-regulatory capacity. An individual's ability to be aware of themselves, their feelings, their thoughts, their reactions, their ability to step back and reflect on those, certainly with the help of others, and then their ability to take that information in very, very deeply and use it effectively to understand why they're responding in a particular way. So why do I love baseball? Personal agency would be my ability to think deeply about that love and its implications for me and my life. And the reason this is important for us is because there is a growing body of research that shows that we can actually bolster personal agency. While there's some innate level of self-regulatory capacity, there are many things we can do to bolster self-regulatory capacities. And I'm working at Notre Dame right now with our students and with our faculty to come up with ways of helping students go through this discernment process more effectively. And we're focusing a lot on students' ability to be self-aware and self-reflective, and then use that information in a self-controlled way to make good decisions about their life. So I mentioned a minute ago that acknowledgement is this key moment in a person's life. Acknowledgement for us is the level of psychological commitment that an individual makes to pursuing their call. What we found is individuals who fully psychologically committed to following the call, wherever it led them, were much more likely to emerge at the end of this process with a strong and positive identity. And those who had a weak or tentative or on-again, off-again acknowledgement were much more likely to stumble through the identity formation process itself. Acknowledgement is a time when most of our pastors would have said that they answered the call to ministry. Acknowledgement, most importantly, is acknowledging to oneself the reality of that deep sense that I should be a particular kind of professional, that I should be a pastor. But it also includes acknowledging to important others, telling important others. That seems to be the critical moment of psychological commitment. When I actually admit to somebody that knows me well and that cares about me that I think I'm supposed to be a pastor, that's the moment in which they're all in. And what we find is to develop this kind of an identity, it's an immersive experience. A person can't go into it tentatively. You'll never undergo the deep sort of personal change that's required to actually take on an identity as someone who's called to a particular profession. This moment of acknowledgement makes all the difference. Clarity through discernment certainly sets someone up for a stronger acknowledgement, but so does being surrounded by positive, supportive others who will acknowledge, yes, of course you don't know for sure whether you should be a pastor, but I see in you the capabilities and characteristics and core commitments that are consistent with being a pastor. And of course, then one of the most important individuals to acknowledge too was one of these admired pastors. Those individuals who could acknowledge to one of their exemplars, I feel a call to ministry, and have that exemplar validate back, yes, I see in you the kinds of things that will make for a good pastor. Those were the individuals who seemed to be all in and on the road to successful identity formation. So acknowledgement, it's a small period of time. You know, we have these wonderful stories of sometimes moments in which a person would go, a pastor would say, I had this growing sense that I should be a clergy, and I just didn't want to tell my spouse. So I set up this great meal, and I was just about to tell him or her, and before I could even get a word out of my mouth, my wife or husband said, I know what you're going to tell me, you're called to ministry. These deeply powerful experiences where somebody had already seen in advance of this individual's admission this deep pattern of capabilities and characteristics and commitments that were consistent with being a pastor. And now with a strong acknowledgement, a willingness to be all in, a willingness to immerse oneself in identity formation, it's really in what we call this integration cycle that identity is formed, more fully formed, more positively formed, and more strongly formed. And integration, again like discernment, it's an iterative, organic, back and forth process that emerges over time. There seems to be two critical components of integration, two critical components for forming this strong, positive pastoral identity. I'll refer to them as personal authenticity and professional authenticity. And the experiences that clergy and physicians and humanitarian workers told us gave us a pattern of the kinds of experiences that cause someone to feel this sense of personal authenticity and this sense of professional authenticity. Now, the formation of the identity then is what emerges, the kind of self-concept that an individual emerges from this process. It takes shape during this time period, and at the end of this, we see the positive, strong identity emerging. And it's really about understanding a way of being, understanding yourself in many ways as a new person, not just the kinds of jobs you'll fulfill, but the sort of person that you are. And so both forms of identity is understanding at a deep level who you are and who you should become to live out this call to ministry. So we identified 4 key experiences that occurred during this integration cycle. Again, these experiences bubbled up over time, accumulated over time in an organic, iterative way. It was not linear at all. But we could identify 4 really important groupings of activities. The first activity is gaining a sense that one can be proficient. What was important for these individuals is to know that they could do the work of a pastor well, to identify the core elements, the core dimensions of the pastoral role, and to gain personal insight that one can do it well. It's okay to know that I'm a good public speaker. It's a far different thing to know whether or not I can preach the word of truth. So what was important during this time was these proficiency experiences, opportunities to try out preaching, to see if you can do it well, to see if you can grow in ability over time. So part of a proficiency experience is that self-feeling that I did well. This is really difficult for pastors to admit, but we found it was important for people to say, you know, I'm not a perfect preacher. There's a lot more room for improvement, but what happened early on was that first, second, third opportunity to preach a sermon, I felt like I could do this. It felt like something true to myself. And certainly another part of proficiency experiences are the responsiveness of others. So pastors told us these glorious stories of the first funeral that they officiated at and the privilege of being with somebody in that very difficult period of their life, but feeling both effective and alive in that moment. Effective in knowing and seeing in the response of the people that they were ministering to that what they were doing was actually helping, but in the same moment feeling a sense of being more alive, of being more who I am, of being more essentially true to myself. Those were the parts of those proficiency experiences that stood out. As I'll mention in a minute, what they needed was somebody to go to and say, wow, I just did this funeral. I thought I did well. I felt alive. And somebody that could help them unpack that experience. To know, in fact, that it's good to feel alive in those moments. You're not taking advantage of somebody's misery. You're actually experiencing your true self at work. And unpack why that scenario went well. Likewise, if they had a deficiency experience, they needed somebody they could go to and unpack, well, why didn't that go well? Is it because I'm not called to ministry? Or is this just part of developing to be a pastor? In my own life, I had a deficiency experience early on, and I didn't have somebody to help me unpack it. I was 36 when I became a professor, Midway through my first year as a professor, one day in class, I suddenly had this overwhelming feeling that I was an imposter. I had this sense that, oh my gosh, Notre Dame's hired me to teach these young people, and I don't know anything, and they've entrusted their children to me, and here I am, a complete imposter, and in fact, it was so overwhelming that I had to stop teaching that day. I made up some excuse and let the students go. I had to go back into classroom the next day. For the next 4 or 5 weeks, I struggled with whether or not I should go to the dean and say, we've all made a terrible mistake, I should quit. Well, I stuck it out. Things got better. 7 or 8 years later, in a lunch with my colleagues one time, I shared this experience, and they said, oh yeah, we all go through that. It's normal. Well, part of understanding and gaining a sense of identity is to know that those are experiences, and in fact, what I learned is that those imposter syndrome are experiences of somebody who's deeply committed to your work. If you really care about your work, you want to be fully proficient, and your fears about being new and maybe not proficient are deeply meaningful to you in those moments. How good it would have been for me to have somebody to help me work through it. These pastors had many proficiency experiences and somebody to help them unpack both those and their deficiency experiences. We also found that another part so this has to do with people understanding, can I use my capabilities to enact this role proficiently? Can I really be good at this pastoral thing? And how do they navigate the things they can do well that are essential to being a pastor, and the things they maybe can't do so well that are essential to being a pastor, and how they begin to understand that they can't do everything well, but they can certainly aspire to get better at all of that. That's a part of these important proficiency experiences. Similarly, these developing a sense of what we're going to call personal essence or personal style was grappling with, can I find a style that fits and expresses my personal characteristics? Can I find a way of being a pastor and doing pastoral activities that fits as many pastors tell us, that fits somebody like me who's an introvert? How can an introvert preach? How can an introvert get in front of people on Sunday morning? And so they had to go through these experiences of understanding their own uniquenesses and how their own uniquenesses could take shape and form as a pastor. Their uniquenesses, not just in terms of general personality traits, but if somebody like me, and we've interviewed some pastors who are also deep and profound baseball fans, how does being a baseball fan show up in my role as a pastor? What role at all does it play in my ability to be a pastor, since it's so important to me? So these experiences of developing a personal style or a personal essence or a personal expressiveness was also an important part of this integration cycle. Trying out doing a funeral in different ways to figure out what style of a funeral fits for me. To try different kinds of preaching, not only to find out which ones I'm more or less effective in enacting, but which ones are truer to me, feel better for me. I did this as a professor. I tried all of the different techniques, straight lecture, cold calling. It turns out the style of teaching that I'm most comfortable with is a conversational style, a casual style. I was told that the right kind of professor is the one who's an authority figure and stands up in front of the class and commands attention. And I was never comfortable, nor was I very good at that. But through a series of experiments and some failures and some successes, I learned not only what style I could be effective, but what style felt right to me and felt comfortable to me. And so integration is trying out the pastoral role, trying out my capabilities, trying out my personal characteristics, gaining a sense that I can do this with proficiency, gaining insights into what elements of pastoral work I'm particularly good at and I love the most, and gaining understanding of my own unique expression of ministry. And so for us, this is what we talk about as understanding a way of being true to myself. For us, the essence of personal authenticity in the pastoral role is learning about what sort of unique pastor I can be, and being comfortable that my expression of ministry is in some ways unique to me, but it's still authentic and still valid. So personal authenticity is focused on the individual's unique expression. Critically important, sometimes difficult for pastors to admit to themselves, but critically important to understand what's unique about me. And what we found is that relationship with parishioners was particularly important during this period of time. seeing the responses of one's enactment of the pastoral role on their parishioners. Did you seem to be having a positive impact? But more important was the response of parishioners to that clergy person. Did they act like you were their pastor? Did they entrust you with those really important parts of their lives? Some of these comments were glorious about these first funerals or these first really important moments of dealing with somebody in a crisis. When the parishioner, and they can remember these so vividly, they would talk about, I was ministering to this family, and the grandmother came up to me and grabbed my hands and said, "You are my pastor." Those moments in which someone conferred back to the individual the legitimacy of their call by showing that the way the pastor was responding to them, they received as a genuine reflection of what it means to be a pastor. This is one of the reasons we feel like those first appointments are so important. A congregation full of individuals who will reflect back positively on a clergy person, that will reflect back positively on their experiments with proficiency, their grappling with their personal style, and in fact help them understand their unique personal authenticity. We feel like those are critically important. Otherwise, these individuals are left guessing about whether or not somebody such as them could really be a clergy person. A bad first appointment leaves them second-guessing themselves about whether their capabilities and personal style can be authentic in a pastoral role. The second important part of this is what we call professional authenticity. Understanding whether my expression of ministry is somehow true to what it means to really be a pastor. And so in this case, two important questions are, is my practice of ministry genuine and valid? This is where peers, the community of pastors, looms largest. The way individuals in any profession know whether or not their particular expression of ministry, their particular expression of a profession, is in fact valid and genuine, is the response of their peers. As important as it is to see that one is making a difference in the lives of parishioners, people could say, look, I just got lucky. But am I actually the kind of individual that represents what it means more universally to be a pastor? This requires a response from the larger community of pastors. We're finding that the most important kind of isolation isn't the lack of individual clergy friends. It's a lack of a sense of membership in the larger community of pastors. And I'll speak to that more specifically in a minute. But one of the reasons that matters is on an ongoing basis, the way professionals know that they're doing their work in a genuine and valid way is the way it's received by their peers. The way their peers respond and say, yes, your unique expression is genuine to what it means to the larger profession. In other words, we are united by some common notion of what it means to be a pastor, and although yours is unique, as is mine, both of them are valid. So part of this is to get responses back from admired clergy, more senior clergy, more experienced clergy, that the way you're doing a funeral is valid and genuine. The way you're doing a sermon is valid or genuine. And we heard from pastors who are currently struggling with their identity many unfortunate stories of that first senior pastor they served under, for whom they could never do anything right. In other words, there was never an experience that my unique way of preaching was valid and genuine. My unique way of doing pastoral counseling was valid and genuine. My unique way of teaching a Sunday school was valid and genuine. These were senior pastors who seemed to nitpick and critique the entire time, so this person emerged from that experience thinking, there isn't anything about my experience that represents this higher ideal of what it means to be a clergy person. So one of the parts of this is the way I'm using my capabilities and characteristics that I experience as being proficient, is it really valid and genuine to what it means to be a clergy person? And secondly then, is my unique pastoral identity, my unique sense of personal authenticity, my own way of being a pastor, is it consistent with what it means to be a pastor? Is my sense of what my unique expression of identity as a pastor is that somehow accepted, recognized as genuine by the larger community of pastors? So those individuals who felt that they belonged, who felt like they experienced validation by their peers, were much more likely to emerge with this deep sense of personal authenticity and professional authenticity. This wonderful interplay of knowing what makes me unique as a clergy and what makes me also like other clergy. this universal aspiration that we have to be a certain kind of person. So what emerges from professional authenticity is a way of being a true pastor. This combination of a way of being true to me and a way of being true to a pastor, and where those things fuse together seems to be the core of developing a strong and positive pastoral identity. And so professional authenticity ends up being extremely important. Now, of all the denominations we've studied, every single one of them, whether they know it or not, has a template of what the right kind of pastoral identity is. There's a kind of compelling understanding of the sort of identity that a pastor has. So if you naturally fit that template, you're more likely to develop this sense of personal authenticity. But what if you don't? What if you are a woman in a male-dominated denomination? What if you are a person of color in a white-dominated denomination? These individuals are the ones for whom membership in the community of pastors may be the most important, but the most difficult. We heard stories of many women clergy who said, you know, early in my career, I didn't fit into the old boys network. Over time, they would say I understood that they were just friends, and they went out to lunch with each other just because they were friends, but they would say early after I was ordained, I wanted so badly to go to lunch with those experienced pastors, but they never invited me. And it made me doubt whether or not they really considered me to be truly a pastor. So this sense of membership, as Wendell Berry would characterize it, is critically important during this time. Am I received by senior leaders of the denomination and treated in a way as a peer, not as a trainee, not as a provisional person, but as somebody who is truly an elder, truly a pastor? Am I experienced and treated by other members, particularly senior and experienced members of my profession, as an individual whose identity is authentic? This sense of membership is deep and profoundly important throughout ministry, but particularly at this early stage. And one of the things we found in our survey, when we asked pastors to comment on their sense of membership in their denomination, it wasn't very high in any of the denominations, but it was lowest in the United Methodist Church. So in a connectional system, this experience of membership across 10 years in ministry was lowest in the United Methodist Church, which, according to our research, bodes very, very poorly for those who are answering a call to ministry. How likely is it that they will actually experience this deep sense of belonging? So membership, experiences as a member, as belonging to the community of pastors, was extremely important in this integration cycle for developing a sense of professional authenticity. But the relationship that mattered more even than congregational responses or the community of pastors was if an individual had a mentor. And I want to describe mentoring as it emerged in our research in two really, really important ways, and then tell you what we found about what are the fundamental underpinnings of a positive mentoring relationship. So part of what a mentor could do for you is to provide what we'd call instrumental support. It's that person that you could call after you've been in ministry for 2 years and you're feeling a little embarrassed and say, I've never done a wedding. How do we do a wedding? Who could provide you with all of the tricks of the trade and the do's and don'ts, that could give you sermon outlines, that could help you develop sermon ideas when you had run dry and were afraid that you'd never come up with a sermon idea again. So instrumental support is not just helping, but it's being able to be vulnerable to this person about your own lack of understanding, about your own sense of failing, about your own struggle, and that individual will step in and help you gain that sense of proficiency that you so badly need. But even more important was that mentors, in a deep and profound way, helped guide these individuals through developing their own personal and professional authenticity. So these are stories of people being sounding boards, of people that I could be profoundly open and honest with, and that would help me understand how, yes, a person such as I, with my own unique expression of ministry, is truly called to be a pastor and truly living out the universal pastoral identity, the universal call to ministry. So there was a great deal of interpersonal contact, of mutual sharing, of mutual vulnerability. And the more senior individual, the mentor, engaging deeply in these conversations to help individuals, as I mentioned earlier, understand why a proficiency experience was so good, to unpack a deficiency experience and to not be unduly challenged by it, to understand how to take your personal characteristics, your own preferences and personality, and express those in an authentic role in your ministry. And all the while, because this individual is an exemplar, confirming to you that you are called, you are a peer, you are a brother or sister in ministry. So individuals who had a mentor were much more likely to emerge from this process with a very strong and positive identity. But a mentor was not somebody who was assigned to them. It was somebody with whom they experienced what we call deep similarity. In other words, these are individuals whose understanding of their true self matched your understanding of your true self. Individuals who'd had similar life experiences, who have similar personalities, who have similar understandings of belief and faith and theology. People who maybe have experienced the same sorts of traumas that you've experienced. We saw many, in fact, most of our mentoring relationships were different sexes. Males mentoring females or females mentoring males. What mattered more was, did that individual resonate with you? Did you see similarities between yourself so that their insights, their advice, and their counsel you would receive as genuinely reflective of somebody like you? So these mentoring relationships tended to form as affinity relationships, sometimes by happenstance, sometimes by luck, as pastors would say. I was lucky to get appointed to a church with this individual as the senior pastor. But the mentor was willing to be open and vulnerable first to the younger clergy, to the developing clergy. It was that first step by the mentor to be open about their own failings, their own struggles as they formed a pastoral identity, their own weaknesses and how they deal with them. It was the mentor's first vulnerability that started the relationship moving forward. Now, over time, mentoring relationships become peer relationships. As the individual's pastoral identity forms, then they can turn from mentor and protege to friend. And we see that at that moment when deep friendships form, is the time which the individual's identity has really crystallized. When I stop being a mentor to that person and we start being mentors to each other, that's a moment in which the pastoral identity has really taken full form. So mentors are critically important. They can't be assigned in the way that we often do. What our research suggests needs to be done is to understand deep similarities between the two individuals and somehow try to help them bump into each other so that they can form this deep affinity relationship of vulnerability, of mutual care, and of this guided identity development. So the integration cycle is the time when pastors emerge from that. They emerge at the end of that period if they emerge with a strong pastoral identity, they really enter into that fourth stage, which is progress towards ideal. What these pastors want to do is for the rest of their lives continue to grow more fully into the pastor they think God created them to be. One of the indicators of a strong positive identity is clarity over what one does well and how one can put that to use, of the weaknesses that you have and how you can overcome those, and this deep sense that there's always a higher level of proficiency, a higher level of personal authenticity that one can aspire to in ministry. So the last phase of this initial identity formation process can continue for the rest of one's career. I never can be a good enough preacher. There's always something more I can learn about that. And once again, personal agency played a critically important role here. Individuals who were more self-aware and self-reflective and had higher self-regulatory capacities were more likely to take the risks they needed to gain a sense of personal and professional authenticity. They are more likely to take the offer to preach on a Sunday and to risk the fear of failure, to risk embarrassment, to try out being a preacher and to learn from that. They were more likely, and oftentimes they attributed this to other individuals, they were more likely to get offered unique opportunities to maybe co-officiate at a funeral when they were really new in their role as an associate pastor, and to not only engage in those sorts of experiences, but to use them as moments to gain proficiency, to gain insight, and to develop their personal experience and personal expression. So personal agency seems to be one of the fundamental underpinnings for going through this entire process well. And I heard self-esteem mentioned earlier, and certainly self-esteem is a part of a strong pastoral identity, But our research suggests what might matter at least as much is this self-regulatory capacity, or this capacity for personal agency, an ability to be self-aware, to reflect on one's responses, and to use what one learns from those reflections to change behavior, to press forward. So what we find then is that the extent to which somebody emerges from the integration cycle with a strong positive identity seems, as I mentioned, to put them on a trajectory for well-being for the rest of their careers. So what we'll continue to do then is assess pastors' identity. We'll use some narrative approaches to assess their identity, and then to follow how that identity changes over time. And we're most interested in how do individuals that emerge from this process with a weak or fragmented or tentative identity, if they can get off of that negative trajectory, what are the experiences that help catapult them back into a sense of a positive identity? But our sense is some of what we found in this process, having a mentor, having proficiency experiences, gaining a sense of personal expressiveness, may be something that an individual can do at any time in their career, and that there may be ways that we can remedy that. So we're going to be publishing this in a more full form on our website, flourishing.nd.edu. And you can also find right now a report on our survey studies. It's a report about the current state of clergy well-being as we see it, and an understanding of some of the primary determinants of higher or lower levels of well-being. And so that's available right now today. And this study that I'm talking about should be posted within the next month. We're writing both a scholarly piece, so a little less readable piece, and one that's written for a non-scholarly audience, so you can access both of them. I'll open up for questions or comments. We have plenty of time, and I'll get them out early for another break.
My name's Deborah. I'm the conference pastoral counselor in South Georgia, and we just came out of our board of ministry 3 days of assessing and voting on candidates. And one of the things I'm having a difficult time expressing to our annual conference is this idea of authenticity. And something you said really provoked a question in me. If authentic communal response is important from peers, from exemplars, what do you do when there's a flawed exemplar or a flawed community surrounding that? And I will only speak for our conference, but we're struggling with the culture of the corporate sense of community and the individual exemplars.
It's a good question, and I'm just going to retreat to my ivory tower because I'm not sure I have a good answer. Actually, we were grappling with this yesterday in our conversation. I think to the extent that our research has insights for us, I think it points to the need to really think about the exemplars that we offer up, the way those exemplars are characterized and why they're offered up as exemplars, and building a community of pastors in new and unique ways. I appreciate some of the efforts that are being done, but I worry about these geographically oriented covenant groups. I mean, what if there's not somebody there that I can see as an exemplar? How do we create better communities of pastors? I think requires, at least according to our model, understanding something about each individual's sense of their true self, this personal authenticity, and trying to help match them with individuals who have something similar. Much more complex, to be sure. In my own conference, I worry that sometimes the clergy that are held up as exemplars, why they are exemplary, tend to be the clergy of large churches. Well, what about individuals of smaller churches? Do we hold up exemplars of individuals from smaller churches? Holding up a range of exemplars, I think, is important. Certainly individuals that get promoted to leadership roles are important. That's a way of somehow designating this person is exemplary. So paying attention to those sorts of things. I think all of that is really important. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I think it's worth paying attention to those sorts of elements to create a good community. A couple of simple things. I've recommended to the Bishop of Indiana that maybe more time at the annual conference should be spent in just letting clergy be together, providing forums. So maybe you have, and this sounds hokey, but it's my best thought, maybe you have a night where there can be tables of things that people enjoy. So there'd be a baseball table, which I would rush to. There can be a book table. This is a way to start to put people together that maybe have some of these deep similarities. So, and I know I'm repeating what was already said, maybe less time in formal meetings and more time and opportunities to bump into each other might be one of those themes. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Jerry DeSobe. I'm a lifelong Chicago Cub fan. And are you?
I'm a long-suffering Kansas City Royals fan.
Okay, well, but not as long-suffering as a Cub fan. I am aware of how that has shaped my ministry in terms of early in life exposing me to hopelessness, defeat, disaster, which led me into my career as a pastor and pastoral counselor. But moving on from that, and I've tried, the question I have is, in terms of the interviews you did, and the folk that, however one defines it, have done well, vis-a-vis the folk that haven't done well, did you find any antecedents to that as you looked at the data? You talked about what happened in their professional development and the ability to use these experiences, but were you able to determine the antecedents that could help us determine who could use those kinds of experiences positively? Does that make sense?
I'll try, and then you
All
come
right.
back. So still in this identity formation process, or after identity, after what I'm calling this integration cycle?
Well, what I'm thinking about, like as an MAS interviewing candidates, are there signs that you've found? You know, we have all kinds of data we use to make a guess at whether they can do successfully what successful clergy do. Were there things that came out in your research that might help us in identifying those things?
I'm going to have to give that some more thought.
Okay, well, go back to your ivory tower and put that on the webpage or something. Okay.
But let me try another tack. I think one of the, and while I know something about the role you played, primarily the stories Kim have told me, I think there are some insights that this may offer you. To continue your work on helping individuals understand their true self, to take the data that you've gathered and help individuals unpack what that means about who they really are, and how a person such as them might be prepared for ministry, or in some cases might not be prepared for ministry. So the feedback being targeted in more developmental ways, and you may be doing this already, with an eye towards true self-knowledge. What can I learn about myself, and what could I do with this sorts of knowledge? If I had to point to one antecedent, it'd be this notion of personal agency, the extent to which somebody is self-aware and self-reflective, and then may be able to use that information to change themselves, to pursue goals, to make choices, important choices in life.
You know, I guess my experience of that in terms of giving feedback, for example, in the candidacy process, would be how the candidate receives the feedback. You know, and we certainly have some candidates who say, that's
good.
BS, you don't know me, God has called me, get out of my way. And there are people that can use that feedback in a more helpful way. And what you're saying is those are the kinds of people that would most likely be successful. How they receive the feedback is indeed an important variable.
One of the things we found, this may be helpful too, so I'm going to keep trying. You know, a professor just keeps talking until the answer falls out somewhere, and all the
or doesn't, as the case might be. Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because I'm the professor, and you just have to sit down.
Right, I understand.
Well, we found that individuals who could tell a rich story about their discernment cycle, could tell lots of anecdotes about how their life added up to a call, were the ones that were more likely to go through this well.
Okay.
So some of the clergy whose well-being scores were low and whose interviews pointed to that they didn't have an identity were some of the most adamant that they were called. But what they couldn't do was tell us these rich stories.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so we
see, you got there. Very good, professor. Very good. All right. Okay. Yeah.
And the only reason I'm hesitant to say that is because we need to gather more data to find out what are the differences in the kinds of narratives, but certainly the ability to tell many rich stories about discernment and how your life added up. Now, I may step on some toes, but the other element was those who were more likely to claim prophetic voice. Those individuals who could say, I had a dream, but didn't have this rich story, they tended to be that kind. Now, some individuals told us of this dream, but could also tell the rich story.
Yeah.
So the prophetic the God's voice was oftentimes offered up by those individuals, and we think maybe in a deep way they're trying to reconcile themselves to what they're doing with their lives. So, well, God must have called to me, and that dream I had, yes, that was my burning bush.
Right. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Please.
I'm just kind of wondering, for the sake of all those who found that downward trajectory, you kind of hate to see them burn alive. Have you found anything we can do to kick off that identity phase again so that perhaps they can re-cement themselves and stop?
I think so.
Down.
I think it's asking them to tell their story. So our first question in these interviews was to say, we'd like to hear the story of how you became a pastor. The richer the story, the more details, the better. We'd say, can you start with that time in your life before you even imagined being a pastor and tell us the story up until that first time that you fully filled the role of a pastor? And what we heard from so many pastors, including those who were flourishing, is how wonderful it was to revisit their call to ministry. In other words, this narrative storytelling had all these salutary effects. We heard the same thing from physicians and humanitarian workers. In fact, our physicians were some of the most fun. They would give us a half an hour for their interview. We never had a physician interview that was shorter than an hour and a half. And they would tell us oftentimes, you know what? That was great. It reminded me of why I felt like I should be a physician. So telling that narrative, and then in our case, we were able to record and transcribe them and then code them, but at least listening to the narrative and spotting the parts that are there and the parts that are missing. Maybe they never experienced those moments of discovering their personal style and helping them do that. Maybe they've been grappling with whether a person with my personal characteristics can really be authentic, and helping them learn how those personal characteristics can be represented in a personal style. So we think just the narrative itself can be really beneficial, both, and this is where I'm way out of my league, maybe in a diagnostic sense, if I can use that word, but also in a sense of helping to repair one's identity, and that's where a mentor or some peers could really step in to help that individual reimagine themselves, reform their identity, or in our case, we'd say reauthor their life story.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Please.
Yeah, Jim Gebhardt from Ohio. Frequently, I will be meeting with a candidate, and when the summary of the evaluation comes up, my recommendations, this person may not need psychotherapy, but they do need, and I think of the word mentor, and I appreciate the way you've used it. I have some problems with that, however, because frequently what they self-select in a mentor merely reinforces pathology or denial or behaviors which are pretentious. Yeah. And that word originally was used historically almost as a midwife. Now, I realize it's taking on a new name, and we got to call it something right there, and that's very important. But don't be surprised that in your future study that those who went on to real well-being had to go through a dark night of the soul.
Oh, they did.
Where some supervisor or some professor kicked them in the rear end and said, what in the world are you doing?
Oh, no, you're absolutely, in fact, almost all of the stories had those dark nights. For those individuals that could emerge from that, they had somebody, oftentimes a mentor, who could help them reconcile with that. It strikes me how important responses as authority figures are. These stories of that professor in seminary who critiqued my first sermon in a very shameful way, that has long-term enduring impact. So they all went through those dark nights, but to your point, they had somebody who could help them process that well. So I had a mentor in my doctoral program, a guy who could say, you know what, Matt, you're very comfortable with other people, but sometimes you talk over them. And how can you understand when it's okay to be a part of a conversation and how you can lead a conversation as a professor and when you need to be quiet because you're trampling on somebody else's role. So that's the mentors help them do that. Now, sometimes a spouse or a good friend could help them through those dark nights, but we absolutely did. I don't know yet. I kind of think of Tolstoy's comment about happy and unhappy families. I'm going to paraphrase. He said, happy families are all happy in the same way. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own unique way. In some ways, I think those pastors who emerge from this process on this downward trajectory may have idiosyncrasies. There may be fewer patterns there. But at least one of them, I think, is that they weren't able to recover from these dark nights of the soul. Nobody helped them understand the implications for their identity and for their ministry. Yeah.
Two kinds of comments. One, From your studies, what do you find in terms of spouse and family and their influences on pastors? The other, and take whichever one you want. The vision for candidacy is much along the line of what you're presenting in your research, and yet the way candidacy gets carried out leaves a lot to be desired at times. Is there a way that we could build more of what you're doing into the candidacy and probationary or provisional processes that we have in the church?
I'll try to answer them in order. I'm still a little bit surprised. Spouses didn't emerge as the critical or even during this identity formation process. They're critical in terms of love and care and mutual support. But they didn't show up very often in the narratives of how I became to learn about myself as a pastor, other than the acknowledgement. They were the person who supported me and believed in me. So we have some unanswered questions about the role of significant others. We need them there. And I think I even experienced this as I became, my identity of a professor developed. I see it in the way Kim's answered her call to ministry. As much as I'd like to think I didn't know anything about being a pastor, so she couldn't really rely on me. You know, if she preached a sermon and she was struggling with it, of course, I always felt like she was the best sermon preacher ever. So we didn't see spouses show up as integral to the identity formation as we thought they might be. We may be missing something, and so we're going to have to dig a little deeper. But certainly having a spouse or other significant other who loves you, who believes in you, who will care for you, who will prop you up during the dark nights, who will celebrate with you when things go well, that's very important for well-being during that period of time, and probably then important for identity development. In terms of your second question, I would, to the extent that I could help, I would love to be a part of a group that starts to reimagine what this process might be like. And how we might use the research that I'm doing, the great research that Duke's doing, the research that I saw just today from the Methodist Church, how we could combine the insights from several different large-scale research studies to reimagine. And I have the great privilege of working with a few seminaries, so Garrett Evangelical, Wesley Theological, Christian Theological, working with the faculties and staffs at those seminaries in a similar way. What are the implications of this research for the work that you're doing? And I would love that. I'll learn a lot. All I can give you now is top-of-the-head ideas, and those probably aren't very good ones. But I hope there are implications. So, thanks.
Doug McCown, MAS. I'm looking at it as a psychologist. I'm hearing some clear, very rich qualitative data. And maybe in the study that you're going to be putting out, the more scholarly, there will be quite a bit of quantitative data and noting of what variables you found significant and what not. I'm just trying to flesh out in terms of looking at it from a standpoint of, okay, these are the outcomes, and these are the key factors that we saw that led to flourishing versus not. I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, when we're sitting with a candidate, what are some real critical things that might be concerning areas that we need to follow up with to catch that so they don't go down the wrong trajectory,
What we're trying to do is we're using three different methodologies. So large-scale surveys, very quantitatively oriented, a deep narrative interview, so rich qualitative data, and then we're launching some daily life studies where clergy will stay for 2 or 3 weeks in a study and give us rich data about their well-being and their experiences for again, maybe 3 weeks or more, and we're going to try to bring all of those together. Where we are now is we have results of our large-scale surveys, the results of our qualitative interviews, and we're trying to do, I think, what you're hoping we will, which is to bring those together. What does the combination of those tell us? The report that's available online really ends with what we think we've learned, but quite honestly, and this isn't just me hoping to get more grants, although I hope to get more grants, I think we've got a lot more unanswered questions than we started with. We know that relationships are hugely important. We talk about different kinds of relationships and how they matter, but we have to dig a lot deeper. And with relationship, or with respect to this study, we have to learn a lot more about these experiences in identity formation. We have to learn a lot more about the characteristics of a strong identity. And then I think we'll get closer to offering you at least some research insights that you could use to answer that very, very important question. It's the kind of question that keeps me up at night in terms of how do we bridge our research, and because we really want it to make an impact in the applied world. I don't think we're there quite yet. Yeah. I think that's it. Do I get to dismiss him for the break? Oh.
Would you thank Dr.